Hello, welcome everybody to another Champions for Earth Ask a Scientist session, and we're proud again to have Charlie Gardner joining us.
Hi everyone.
Charlie is a conservationist, an activist, a writer and researcher, and on his Twitter profile states that he is rebelling against extinction, which I think, a valid cause if there ever was one. So today I'm going to pass to Laura. She's going to start with some questions for Charlie. We'll go through them, and at the end of a few questions, we'll have an opportunity to open up the discussion. So if you have any questions, keep them in mind. And again, if you want to chuck them in the comments, feel free, and we'll get to a certain point and I'm happy to read out those comments to Charlie or those questions. So that'll be ours for tonight, and then we'll aim to finish bang on 9 o'clock. So hopefully you can all stick around for that. Okay, thank you again for coming, Charlie, and I'll pass over to Laura.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Champions for Earth again this evening for our Ask a Scientist session. It can actually really help for some if whilst we're doing this session, you just turn your videos off just to help the bandwidth. That would be brilliant. Thank you. So first question, Charlie. You're a conservation ecologist, but I've noted that you are spending much more time focusing on the climate crisis. And I just wonder how the ecology and climate, how the two sort of mesh together. What's the connection between the two?
Thanks, Laura. They are connected in all sorts of ways, and the more I've learned about climate change, the more I've come to see that. So I've always been really interested in nature. It's all I've ever wanted to do was try and conserve the world's biodiversity. But when I first started thinking about climate change in about 2015, for a while I started to move away from thinking about conservation and thinking about wildlife, because climate change just was so huge that its impacts on the natural world are going to be so massive that I thought there's no point in conservation. There's why try and conserve wildlife when if we don't get a good handle on climate change, there will be no wildlife in the future. So climate change impacts the natural world in lots and lots of ways. More and more we're seeing the impacts of extreme weather events like wildfires and storms, which can destroy huge amounts of habitat. Sometimes that can even drive an entire species extinct. There's a couple of species of bird that only exist on one single island in the Caribbean, and there's been one tornado that wipes out their habitat entirely, and they go extinct. But beyond that, every species on Earth is being impacted by climate change because the changes are so huge and so rapid. And there are three ways basically that any species can respond to climate change. One is to physically evolve, change its body size or whatever, but climate change is happening too fast, so that's just not happening. So the two things that species are doing is they're shifting where they live, or they're changing their seasonality. Obviously, if you've evolved to keep within a certain set of conditions, and then the climate's changing, you've got to move to stay within those same conditions. So species are moving towards the poles, and they're doing it really, really quickly. Every year in the papers, you'll see reports of new Mediterranean fish species that have been caught in British waters, or new birds that are moving northwards here. And species have done that. They've responded to climate change quite successfully in the past. It's a past climate change. It was only like 12,000 years ago. All of Scotland was under glaciers. It was under big ice sheets. There were no plants or animals there at all. So all the plants and animals in Scotland today have expanded northwards to occupy the land as the ice sheets have disappeared. And so animals can move, but the problem is that when they've done that in the past, that was in an intact world where there was connectivity between habitats and stuff, and the world just isn't intact anymore. We've destroyed 90% plus of most natural habitats. So species can't shift in response to to the climate change as they need to. The other thing they're doing is they're changing their seasonality, and like obviously we'll all have noticed spring becoming earlier and earlier in the year, and the flowers getting out earlier, and blokes in shorts and t-shirts earlier and earlier. So species are responding to the change in the weather by changing their seasonality. The problem is they're all doing it at like slightly different rates and in response to different cues. So the connections between them are breaking down. All these different species have evolved to to be breeding or whatever at just the right time in relation to other species, and now that's not happening. So one really well-researched example of that is with our oak forests and gardens here in the UK. So oak trees are coming into leaf earlier and earlier, and there's a caterpillar, the caterpillar of the winter moth, that is able to keep up. The moths are laying earlier and earlier, and the caterpillars are emerging at the right time. But the birds, the blue tits and the grey tits and the other things that eat those caterpillars, they just haven't started breeding, haven't been able to shift their breeding early enough. So what's happening is obviously, the blue tits are adapted to, they want to breed at the moment when there's maximum amount of caterpillars. But now that's not happening. When the chicks are hatching, most of the caterpillars are already gone. So it's having an impact on the bird breeding, but it's also having an impact on the trees, because now there's nothing to eat all the caterpillars. So the caterpillars are rampaging, eating all the leaves, and the trees are suffering. They're not putting on as much mass and stuff. So so this breakdown in like the timings of different species is really important. And what we're seeing is our ecosystems are breaking down, basically. And with some, it's really, really worrying. So coral reefs are a huge worry. They need particular conditions to thrive. And when the water's too hot, they bleach. And if that carries on happening, they die. So, and this isn't just a wildlife issue. They're full of lovely fish and stuff, but something like 500 million people depend on fish from coral reefs for their main source of dietary protein. So and like in a 2-degree world, there will basically be no coral reefs anymore at all. Tropical forests, like there's lots of increasing research now saying tropical forests are just going to be really rare if they exist at all in the 2-degree world. We've seen how they burn over the last few years, but forests make their own rain, right? By evaporation of water from their leaves, and that's not happening with climate change, and with them being degraded by cutting and stuff. They're just not making as much rain anymore. So then it gets drier, and then the forest can't grow in these dry conditions. So climate change really is just the biggest threat there is to the natural world. I've been thinking about threats to the natural world all my life, and have been so concerned about deforestation and overfishing and all these things, but climate change just overwhelms all of them if we don't get a handle on it. So for a long time I was thinking, right, I need to leave conservation behind, I need to focus on climate. But actually climate change sort of, even though climate change threatens the natural world, it makes conservation even more important, because we can't address climate change without maintaining the natural world. So we all know about how lots of ecosystems, forests and wetlands and things are really big stores of carbon. So when they get destroyed, that carbon gets released into the atmosphere, and now obviously that's really bad news. But they're not just stores of carbon; they absorb carbon as well, and so they're what we call carbon sinks, and they're a huge store of carbon. So of all the emissions we emit from burning fossil fuels and the rest of it, about a quarter of them are absorbed by the ocean. About a quarter of them are absorbed by the natural world, by soils and forests and plants, and about half stays in the atmosphere. So without nature, a lot more of our emissions would be staying in the atmosphere. And so it's really, really, really important that we conserve nature. Unfortunately, we've got this sort of bad sort of feedback loop situation where the way we're reacting to climate change, you know, nature is so important in the fight against climate change that we absolutely must prioritize conserving nature. And the recent IPCC report was quite clear on that. Maybe we can speak about that later. But instead, what we're doing is, as climate change worsens, we're reacting to climate change by destroying nature even more, both from the way we adapt to climate change and in our efforts to mitigate it. So one thing we don't hear a lot about is the way that you know, when climate change has negative impacts on people, they often respond by you know, increasing their dependence on nature and, you know, using nature in unsustainable ways. And this was something I saw you know, firsthand when I lived in Madagascar. So I worked in Madagascar for 10 years. And in the region where I live, it's a really dry region, and people are farmers, right? What most people want out of life is just to have a nice bit of land that they can farm just for subsistence for their family. But you know, there's no irrigation, so the farming depends on the rain. And with climate change, you just can't predict the rain anymore. The rainy season is just completely out of whack. And if you don't know when it's going to rain, then you can't grow your crops because, you know, you don't know when to plant. So lots of people are having to abandon farming as a livelihood because of climate change. And in this country, you know, if a farmer loses her crops because of bad weather, you know, she'll have crop insurance and the government you know, offers some safety nets, but that just doesn't happen in Madagascar. And so when people lose their crops, it's nature that is the safety net. Like in the region where I live, people, when they did lose their crops, they had four options of what they could do in response. One was to, you know, go to the city and hope to find work. Another was to go to the coast and become a fisher person. Another was to go up onto the hills and clear more forest to do some shifting cultivation, what we used to call slash and burn agriculture. Or another one was to go into the forest and make charcoal, you know, cut trees to bake charcoal for sale in town. So of the four options that people have to adapt to climate change, three of them depend on nature and on, you know, using forests or the sea in, like, you know, quite unsustainable ways. And this is a real issue that we just don't hear much about, because everywhere around the tropics now, where people, you know, just their livelihood is based on small scale farming for themselves, everywhere around the tropics, this farming is being disrupted. And you know, the people are having to turn to forests, or yeah, you can always find something to eat or sell in the forest. And this is a real issue, and it just shows we are one of the many ways that climate change is actually making conservation much worse.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, from my first-hand experience, just trying to keep an allotment watered in the drought in the UK, just my livelihood doesn't depend on that. I can understand the heartache and trauma that it's causing people all around the world as our climate does affect our ecology. Thank you for that. Very, yeah, and just the coral reefs and our tropical rainforests, and the fact that we stand to lose those is just so heartbreaking. And it really motivates me to want to do everything that I can in my power. But those in power that have the highest amount of power, or we perceive them to, is the United Nations, our global leaders, and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who put out these reports. And the latest one came out in the past week or so. I was listening to your video analysis about that today with Claire Farrell, and we'll share the link to that video so everybody can get a more in-depth analysis of that summary for policymakers from the synthesis report. But I just thought if you could just share sort of a few of the key highlights from that report and your takeaways from it.
Right. So yeah, this was a really important report because the the IPCC publish these big assessments in like 8-year cycles. So the last one was in 2014. And so we've heard a lot about IPCC reports over the last year and a half or so. And that's because each assessment cycle, they publish 4 massive reports. One is on the physical science of climate change, what's going on and how bad it will be if we don't get a handle on it. The second is about our vulnerability and the impacts and how we adapt to it. And then the third is about mitigation, how we decarbonize, how we stop climate change. And then the fourth is the synthesis, which basically brings together, it synthesizes those other 3 reports. So this is really important because it's the synthesis of this, the final report of this 8-year cycle. And particularly important because, because it's an 8-year cycle, then the next one won't be until 2030. And if we haven't, made all the changes that it says we need to make by 2030, then, it's too late. So we hear final warning in the headlines all the time, but this was a bit of a final warning. We really have to do it. And so there was nothing new in it. It said the same thing we'd have heard in the headlines recently, but ultimately, it was just very, very clear that how bad things will be unless we decarbonize incredibly rapidly and massively. So we need to cut our emissions in half by 2030. And it showed that we're just not doing that at all. So one of the most interesting things for me was that it sort of offered us a progress report on how how good global government's progress is towards the goal of keeping to 1.5. So the way the global legislation, the Paris Agreement works is that each country has to make a pledge. They call it an NDC, a nationally determined contribution. Each country makes a pledge. This is how fast we're going to decarbonize. And then from that, you can calculate what the temperature might be if every country was to meet its pledges. And basically, they calculate that if every country was to meet its pledges, then we'll reach 2.8 degrees by the end of the century. 2.8 degrees is just, unimaginable, very probably unlivable. I don't think anyone can really seriously imagine an organized human society persisting at 2.8 degrees. That's where we'll get if every country meets its pledges. So the first thing, the pledges are not strong enough at all. They really need to be strengthened. However, it gets worse because those are just promises, and for the most part, they're empty promises. A pledge is just empty unless it's backed up by policies that will allow you to meet those targets. And for the most part, that's not happening. So with current policies, the projected temperature by the end of the century is 3.2 degrees. And Britain's a really great example of not backing up our pledges with actual policies. So like in 2019, we were the first industrialized country to set a decarbonization target. We said 2050 target, excellent, and we were really proud of ourselves. That was in direct response to the first big Extinction Rebellion protests, by the way. So that was a huge, massive outcome of those protests. But so the government said, right, we're going to decarbonize. Since then, they've announced a new coal mine. They've announced, they're going to open hundreds of new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. They announced the £27 billion road building program. They've thrown their weight behind airport expansions. They won't put in place better housing standards. So we're still building brand new houses right now that are going to have to be immediately retrofitted if we're going to meet our decarbonisation targets because they're built to such low standards. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So, yes, we've made a promise to decarbonise by 2050, but it's just talk. There's no action. Right, sorry. IPCC report. Need to. I get go off on one when I think
So
about
Antonio
recovery.
Guterres pulled the date from 2050 forward to 2040. And I just wonder what your opinion is on those dates and the net part of net zero, and like the feasibility of offsetting our way out of this.
Yeah. So I can't comment on the dates specifically. I haven't looked at the models, and that's not really my thing. But just any distant target, like be it 2040 or 2050, is hugely dangerous, because it just allows you to kick the can down the road. It's like, well, I'm not going to be around then. It just, so, you know, leave my successors to do the really difficult stuff. And so it just ends up with stuff not being done. So really need interim targets, strong interim targets. And that was why I really liked XR's initial target of net zero by 2025, because, you know, yeah, you're not going to achieve net zero by 2025, but if you try, then you might get 2050. Sorry, you might get 2030 or 2035. Whereas if you're only going to try for 2050, then you're not even going to start till 2045. And it's not when you stop that actually matters, it's how much you emit in the meantime, because it's the emissions that count. So if you just emit massively until 2045 and then start acting, you'll have emitted a huge amount compared to if you start now. So the big cuts need to be upfront. They really do. Cuts now are worth much more than cuts later. As for offsetting, yeah, so this is really difficult. Like we talked about, you know, the role of nature, and you know, we need to conserve nature to help in the fight against climate change. We absolutely need to, but we don't. But what happens with offsetting is, you know, a company says, okay, I'm going to pay X amount to plant some trees or to conserve some bit of existing forest, and that will allow me to continue polluting, continue with my massive carbon emissions. And we just cannot continue with massive carbon emissions. They need to stop. So, and you know, to be honest, tree planting doesn't really work. So I think, you know, conserving existing forests is really important. But the amount of stories of the amount of, you know, tree planting or offset schemes that they just fail, because there's no follow-up, there's no care, there's no, and yeah, they're just cheap get rich quick schemes. But so no, we cannot offset our way out of this. We need to decarbonize, you know, and there are some things that are very difficult to decarbonize. Our last residual bits of emissions will need to be offset with other things, but it's not the easy emissions cuts that need to be offset. We just need to make those emissions cuts. So apart from nature, the other thing we talk about with sort of offsetting our emissions is carbon removal technology, so carbon capture and storage. So actually, you know, either sucking carbon directly out of the atmosphere, or, you know, or catching the carbon out of smokestacks as it gets released and stuff. And this is really difficult. So, you know, so ultimately, it's not emissions that matter. It's concentrations in the atmosphere, concentrations of greenhouse gases, and they are already too high. Even if we stopped emitting tomorrow, they're already too high, way above the safe level. So, so I do think, you know, one day in the future, if we ever have the technology, then having, you know, machines to suck that out of the sky would be really good. However, they don't exist now, right? And we're pinning huge amounts of hopes on them. Lots of the scenarios that you see in IPCC reports, you know, when you look at the footnotes and the small print, those scenarios are actually based on technologies that don't exist yet, so, which is really worrying. But the problem, you know, it's particularly problematic because it's being used as an excuse to continue emitting now. We're like, okay, it's okay, it doesn't matter, we can continue burning fossil fuels because sometime in the future we will have machines to suck the the emissions out of the atmosphere again. And there's just so many things wrong with that. Like, you know, one, it's just magical thinking. We don't have that technology. Like, what the fuck? It's, you know, sorry for swearing, sorry. And the other thing is, you know, lots of bad stuff happens in the meantime. In the meantime, while we're continuing to emit and wait for magical technologies, in the meantime, people are suffering and dying from the you know, impacts of what we're causing, and it might trigger irreversible changes like cascade effects. Like, you know, if it gets so hot that all the forests burn, for example, and we lose all that carbon stored in all the world's forests, then you'll never be able to suck that out of the atmosphere. So I think, sorry,
yeah,
really quickly, I just want to wrap up with this one analogy because I really like it. You know, imagine your bath is overflowing, right? So carbon removal technology is going out to the shops to go and buy a mop and a towel and running back so you can mop up all the excess water. But first thing you need to do is you need to turn off the tap. You don't go out and go and invest in your mop. You turn off the tap. And that is what we need to do. We need to turn off the tap of emissions by stopping burning fossil fuels.
yes, indeed. And even all the kids in year 2 could tell you that that's what you need to do. So the IPCC report tells governments what they should do about this. What should we do if governments aren't doing what they're being told to do? I don't know whether we can tie this in. You've got these beautiful analogies about the social science. Perhaps we'll go there first, but it will need to be quite quick because I don't.
Yeah, sorry, I've been rambling on far too
question.
much. I'm really sorry.
I have to hand over to Katie. But sharing that social science analogy would be brilliant.
So yeah, the thing that's really startling about the IPCC report is not so much what it contains for me, but what's missing. Like, you know, everything in there is about essentially what governments should do, and they're not doing it. And like, so it just feels a bit like, you know, we need to stop banging on that same drum. This is the 6th assessment report. It's been 30 years they've been producing these reports saying, governments, you really need to do this right now, and governments are not doing it. And the reports don't. So for me, the obvious question is the one you posed. It's like, well, how do we make governments do it then? And for some reason, the IPCC didn't talk about that at all. They just don't talk about it. You know, it's really emerging science. You know, how do we change everything? You know, how do we rapidly change the world in a way that's never been done before? So there isn't lots of knowledge about this. There isn't lots of research on it, and we're finding it out by doing it, really. My understanding of social science, basically, basically the reason why you know, governments haven't acted on the science despite having all the knowledge is because, you know, decision making ultimately isn't about knowledge, it's about power and influence. And, you know, the fossil fuel industry and aviation industry and car industry and beef industry and, you know, agrochemical industries, these are all massive industries that are just unimaginably profitable, and, you know, they're doing very well out of the way the world is now, and they don't want to change. They don't want limits on their corporate behavior to be placed on them. So they are fighting against climate action, you know, because that would limit their profit making. And so for me, you know, we need to stop thinking about, you know, giving governments the information. We need to think about the power at play behind this policy making. And for me, the only way to counter that is with people power. And, you know, the social science is you know, really hot on the concept of social tipping points these days. And basically, social tipping point is just another word for people power, as far as I'm concerned. It's basically, you know, we're only going to get the change we need when there is just this critical mass of people, so many people demanding change. You know, so many people changing their own lifestyles, that high carbon lifestyles just come to be regarded as terrible and unethical. So many people demanding change that everyone starts to see fossil fuels as just really the really evil bad guys, and they lose their license to operate. So many people standing actively resisting destruction, those destructive ways just stop being profitable. But it needs to be about having enough people that our power is enough to overcome the power of the vested interests. And so there's lots of talk now about how we build that power, and reading about that has made me quite hopeful, because it turns out we often think taking climate action, there's no point, it's not going to affect anything, it's just me, I'm just one person out of X million people, what change is that going to make? But it turns out our ideas and our actions are really, really contagious, and they inspire other people. People looking at satellite images, people have used like Google Earth to look at satellite images of houses, of towns, and they see that solar panels on roofs, for example, they're not randomly occurring across a town, they're in clusters, because whenever someone gets one, other people nearby also start thinking about it. They're like, oh, I wonder how much money that guy's saving. And then you do something, and then it becomes less weird and strange and new and scary for the other people who see you do that. If you get a plant-based burger in the pub instead of the meat-based burger, and not only are you sending an important signal to the pub and the producers to make them think, oh, maybe there's something in this, maybe I should offer more plant-based things, and that makes it easier for other people to do it. But also, like, other people that see you get it normalizes it. So yes, Etienne just put it in the chat what I'm going to come to. So the way this social contagion works, the way how it can build to a massive momentum, and the way it does that, we've all experienced this, is like, imagine yourself at a festival or party, and you've had a couple of drinks or whatever, and music's good, but no one's dancing. So of course, no one's dancing. You don't want to be that first person to step up, and you're scared to show off your moves in front of everyone. But someone does, and you're a bit more tempted, but they're a bit weird. So you're like, oh yeah, no, I don't know, I'm not going to associate with that weird person. But then a couple of other people do start dancing too, and that like opens the floodgates, and you got your safety in numbers. You lose your inhibitions because you're in a crowd, so you can join and safely dance, and you're boogieing away. And if the atmosphere is really, really good, then it can reach a tipping point. So it reaches this point where so many people have joined the dance that even the people that didn't want to dance in the first place, they now feel a bit weird because they're not dancing. They now feel like they're missing out on something. So they joined in, even if that wasn't of interest to them in the first place. Because we go with the crowd, we follow the crowd. We're social animals, we're herd animals. That's what we do. And so this is what I think we need to do as people that know about climate and nature emergency, is be the second and third dancers on the dance floor. Like, it's the scientists and the first activists are the first dancer on the dance floor, but it's the second and third dancers that validate them, turn them from the lone, like outsider or weirdo into a group, and then the magic happens. And I think so that's something we all could do, because we we can turn this, so environmentalism, thinking about our planet, this has always been this weirdo, hippie thing that most middle of the road people don't want to associate with, because it's those weird greenies. But so we need to change that. We need to make it mainstream, and that's something that we all can do. And I think this is where people with a platform, people that have the respect of other people, like athletes, can play a really, really important role. I mean, everyone can play a really important role because everyone is like a source of contagion. I wish there was a good word for contagion. It makes you think of diseases, but yeah, everyone's leads by example to other people. But if you have a platform, then it's just that much more powerful. Greta Thunberg said something once. Oh, I wish I hadn't said this because I can't remember the quote, but it was something about the higher the bigger your emissions, the more your responsibility, but the bigger your platform, the greater your I want to say responsibility again, but it wasn't. But you know what I mean? Yeah, if you have the more that people will listen to you, the more that you have real power to help build momentum towards the social tipping points we need. And you know, with that power comes a sort of you know, we're in an emergency. We need to use the powers that we have available to us. You know, each of us has to act in the way that is most powerful. I, for example, I started in activism just as an individual. And then I realized, actually, I'm more powerful if I act as a scientist because this gives me legitimacy and authority, and people respect scientists. So even though I am just a person, I take action as a scientist. And so, you know, someone with a platform might take action in their personal life, and that's great and it's wonderful, but it's much less powerful than visibly taking action as the public persona, you know what I mean, as the sports star rather than as little old me.
Hugely inspiring, Charlie, that you are. And Sheila here said, you know, the source of contagion could be source of inspiration.
Thank you. Brilliant, Sheila. Absolutely.
And absolutely love the analogy of dancing, and let's have sports people out there as the second and third dancers on the dance floor, inspiring others to come and join us and use our powerful reach that we have to communicate these issues. So I've run out of time in my slot. I'm going to add the last couple of questions into the chat and see if Katie brings them in, but let's open the floor to those that have been here today who are writing their questions in the chat, and any others, quickly drop them down. Thank you so much, Charlie. I'll hand over to Katie.
Thank you, Laura. Cheers, Charlie. So first one from Greg Rowe is, how do you see human migration developing as a result of climate change and food shortages?
Yeah, this is going to be just so massive. It really is one of my huge fears for the future of our society, because ultimately it's not so much climate impacts that worry me, but it's how humans respond to that. So obviously we've always, for years and years and years, we've known about sea level rise, right? And you know, there's been stuff known for a long time about how many of the world's great cities are going to have to relocate. Mumbai, Kuala Lumpur, Miami, New York, all these places are highly vulnerable to flooding. London is one of them. So, and these are massive population centers, of course. So everyone living in these coastal areas is going to have to move inland, hugely disruptive. But there was a newer study, a newer piece of research that came out just a couple of years ago, which was really frightened the life out of me, because it showed that basically they looked at all the places where human beings do live and don't live on Earth, and they looked at all the climate characteristics of those places, and they found that if there's an average temperature across the year of above I can't remember, was it 29? Anyway, I can't remember, above a particular temperature, humans cannot live in this place. And for now, it's it's a couple of spots in the Sahara on the Horn of Africa. It's just hardly any of the planet. By 2070, not 2100, but by 2070, under a high emission scenario, then basically massive great swathes of the tropics become uninhabitable to human beings. Huge great chunks of Africa and South America, like most of India, all of Pakistan, just uninhabitable to human beings. So we just won't be able to live there. Beyond that, there's, what about where can we grow crops? And that's a huge issue too. So human migration is going to be an incredible issue. It's possibly the defining issue of this century, as far as I'm concerned. And it's happening already. It's not, this is not simply a future issue. Internal migration in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa is a massive issue already. I think the only answer really is to open borders. This is politically just a hugely difficult thing, but I'm convinced actually that it is one that politicians are reacting to. We always think, why aren't our governments doing anything about climate change? Well, hang on. So in the US, they wanted to put a massive border against their southern, a massive wall, against their southern border. All the Mediterranean countries, Italy is criminalizing people for trying to save lives, save drowning people. In the UK, we're criminalizing these stuff. So I think, this is a preemptive reaction by our governments to climate change. They are already adapting to climate change. They're not calling it that. But of course, that type of approach will, can only result in the deaths of tens or hundreds of millions of people. So for me, the only way forward is to open borders. But migration is a defining issue, and of course it's going to be it's harder to address because it's not one that people want to talk about, because people on the left don't want to talk about things that will attract the right, basically. These issues about migration and things, they raise the specter of what we call eco-fascism, which is fascism carried out in the name of ostensibly environmental concerns, and it's a real terrifying prospect. So people don't like to talk about the issue of growing migration, but it will be a big one.
Yeah, and it's a tough one to face, isn't it? As I was sitting here quite comfortably. I recommend anybody who's super interested in this to watch the film Human Flow. It's filmed on an iPhone on a lot of the borders, and it's just a fascinating insight into what's actually going on around the world. Now over to Dave Hampton. Thanks, Charlie. I get that it's all already very bleak. How do you and we preserve our sanity, equanimity, and ability to function in the face of all of this, without shutting down, breaking down, or otherwise losing the plot, losing heart, and losing connection? Sending Dave a big hug.
I feel you, Dave. It is tough. It's really tough. I've been struggling a bit now and again. I think for me, it's not so much that I cope. I don't necessarily do particularly cope. It's just that, what else am I going to do? Like, I'm always going to fight this fight, whether I have any hope, whether I feel we're going to win or not, because what else am I going to do? I'm not just going to sit back and, just sit it out. That's not an option. Nevertheless, I don't know. I do draw strength from a lot of things. I like to take time away from the screen, spend it, I don't know, with my fingers in the soil in the garden, or going for a walk, listening to the birds. I think that I find really regenerative. You meet wonderful people in this movement, and that's a really big thing for me. And sharing things, sharing experiences with such wonderful people. yeah, makes me feel much less alone. I think it's really easy to feel alone when we just see, seemingly the whole of society just going about their daily lives. There's just nothing's going on, but I think savoring the small wins, because there's a lot of bad news around in this business, especially. But we have victories too, and our actions are effective. So savoring the small wins, I think, is really good and important for me. But mainly, I don't know as much as, so yes, it's hard because doing this means you have to expose yourself to lots of knowledge and lots of bad news. But it's given me a sense of purpose that I've never had. Even as a conservationist, I've never had such a sense of purpose. And I think that's something a lot of people really lack. We have huge mental health crises across all sectors of society. And I think some part of that for some people is that they don't feel part of something. They don't feel they're contributing to something. But in the climate movement, you really do. And I think that helps me a lot too.
That's a lovely way to put it. Thank you. This one from Russell Seymour. We focus on burning fossil fuels, and of course that is really important, but the contribution of construction through cement is massively significant, along with agriculture. So back to your analogy, like how do we turn off the tap? And specifically he's put in construction, but I guess in general too.
Yeah, so concrete is a real a massive contributor. I have to say, I'm afraid I don't know about how the technology is progressing for low carbon concrete. There are lots of other building materials that can be made more sustainable, and wood is a good one. Wood is a great way of actually using wood in construction is a great way of carbon dioxide removal. You grow your wood, you cut your trees, but instead of burning them for energy, which is what we do in Jack's power station, which is just crazy nonsense, you build a house with that wood, and then that's long-term or medium-term at least carbon storage. Sorry, I can't remember what the question was.
Like, how do we turn the tap off?
Concrete, that's what it was. Concrete, sorry. Yeah, I don't know about concrete and cement specifically, but like what I was saying before when we were talking about offsets, there are going to be some sectors that are really, really hard to decarbonize, but other things are not. Like transport, really easy to decarbonize, comparatively. Electrification, really easy to decarbonize. Agriculture, really easy. But there are some things like, the small amounts of aviation that we'll have and concrete and other things, they're hard to decarbonize. So we need to save. That means, all the easy stuff we need to do, and we need to do it now. And, any remaining offsets and any sort of technology we have for carbon dioxide removal, or any ecosystems that we're restoring to sequester carbon dioxide, they will be used to offset those last few emissions from concrete or whatever that we haven't been able to do through switching technologies.
But we'll try to squeeze a few more questions in. Sheila wants to know why the politicians don't seem to care as much as the rest of us.
It's not that they don't necessarily care. So I think that there's a couple of different components to this. So there's a researcher called Rebecca Willis that did some really good research with MPs in UK Parliament, and it's basically they don't know how. They're terrified. Like this is the biggest challenge that there has ever been, right? And it's scary, it's terrifying. They don't know what to do. They just don't know what to do. So they pass the buck and avoid doing it. But that's a secondary issue. I think the first thing is, political corruption. Like we don't call it corruption, we call it lobbying, or we call it political donations, but let's call it what it is. It's corruption. It's private interests, corporate interests, donating money and lobbying to get political decision making in their favor. I think we have a broken and corrupt political system, and which means that the private money of the few counts for a lot more than the votes of the many.
I guess that kind of ties in with Annie's question too about how much of a problem do you see the mainstream media playing a negative and divisive role towards collectively engaging everyday people to tackle environmental, ecological, climate chaos?
Oof, yeah, massive. In so many ways, like you mentioned, the word divisive there, and I think that's been massive. Like, you know, the way that they have absolutely demonized climate activists is really extraordinary and shows how powerful they are. And I really felt that with Insulate Britain, right? Because Insulate Britain was such a good campaign. It was such a well-chosen target. They chose insulation because it's the most pro-poor carbon you know, decarbonization policy you can do. You know, the right-wing media have always said, oh, you can't decarbonize because it will hurt the poor. Not that they care about the poor, obviously. So Insulate Britain were like, well, if that's what they're going to say, you know, we will demand insulation that, you know, that a climate action that helps the poor most, and public climate action that is, you know, quite obviously in the interests of everybody in Britain. And yet the media still managed to turn most people in Britain against Insulate Britain. They managed to get people to hate Insulate Britain, even though Insulate Britain was clearly, very obviously, the good guys in this situation. So it does worry me how this divisiveness. The other thing, beyond you know, divide, trying to other climate activists and present environmentalists as some weirdos that aren't like you, so don't listen to them. The other thing they do, of course, is belittle and diminish the climate emergency. And the classic tactic for that is just, you know, denialism, pretending it's not happening or not covering the news. But yeah, I don't know if you, there was quite a well-known example last week in the wake of the IPCC report being published. The Daily Mail covered this report on page 19 in a small, tiny little article on the bottom of the page, underneath a massive full-page spread about a parking row between two pensioner ladies about like something about their geraniums, right? And to me, this is even worse than like not covering the news at all, because this has this like subtle, you know, we talked about social contagion and getting your cues from others and stuff. I wonder if this has this subtle effect when you see, you know, the headline was "Climate Catastrophe Imminent," says United Nations, but when you see that on the bottom of page 19 underneath a row about some geraniums, I don't know, subconsciously that must make you think, well, this must be bullshit. This can't be important. How could this, if this was important, it would be on page 1. But it's at the bottom of page 19, so it cannot be anything to worry about. And so as a result, most people don't worry about it. There was another report came out last year, said that in 2020, the word cake was mentioned 10 times more than climate change on UK TV. Like, just, yeah, crazy stuff.
You Brits do love a cake, though, don't you?
Well,
A cup of tea. I guess that brings it around again to why it's so important to use our voices and our platforms to counteract all of that. Which comes to Laura's question, which will probably be the last one for tonight before we go to Etienne to wrap up. So why have you chosen to take direct action as part of Scientists' Rebellion?
Frustration, basically. Yeah, because so I became a scientist because I wanted to do something about this planetary crisis, and I guess I sort of naively thought that, you know, become a scientist, get the information together and give it to the governments, and they'll use it to make good decisions, and they'll use it to make good decisions in the interest of everybody. But but they haven't. And, you know, with climate change and the destruction of nature, it's just so obvious. Scientists have been giving them this information for so long, and they're just ignoring it. And it's because of what we were talking about a minute ago. Sorry, I can't remember whose question that is, but it's because of political corruption. It's because they're not listening to the scientists. They're listening to fossil fuel lobbyists. So I just started to realize that I was in the wrong game. This idea that I could, you know, help make a difference to the world through providing information, that wasn't working. No one was listening. And so, you know, so I realized that actually, yeah, I started thinking about why governments don't make decisions based on the science, and started thinking about the power. And that was when I started realizing that actually, yeah, the answer is power. And so we have to use our people power. And around that same time was when Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion hit the streets in 2018. So I'd been, for a while, I'd just been so frustrated. I knew that just doing research and teaching just wasn't enough. It wasn't making a difference, but I couldn't see anything else I could do. There just didn't seem anything worthwhile that, you know, really would make a massive difference. And then Extinction Rebellion came along, and I was like, yes, aha, this is what I've been waiting for. Finally, someone is treating this as serious as it needs to be treated. And yeah, just jumped in from there, really.
And so if you were to like recommend to anybody here watching this how to like step into being a part of that people power right now, what would you recommend or say to them? Just come along. Just wait. So we got a big event in April. I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about that, but oh yeah, it's April already. So in 18 days, 21st of April, that's what I did. So yeah, I've been following Extinction Rebellion a little bit on Facebook, but there were no local groups near me, so there was no way I could get involved. And then I just, I'd heard that they were going to be having a big thing in London, so I just hopped on a train, went down to London, and it was just great. The atmosphere was brilliant, and I was just finally, I was surrounded by all these people that felt the same way as me, and it felt so liberating. I was like, yes, I'm not alone. There are people that care as much as me. Yes, fantastic. And that was it. And then from there, while I was there, I was like, oh, I really need to start a local group in my town in Norfolk. And so I was speaking to people. I was like, how do you start a local XR group? And they were like, oh, just make a Facebook page, and there you have it. And so I went home and started a local group in Kings Lynn, and all took off for that. But yeah, just go, basically. So if there's a local group near you, find your local group on social media, get yourself along to a meeting, and if not, just go to London for a big event. Nice. We're coinciding our Champions for Earth Day around that time too, so we're hoping to bring together athletes around that time as well. So that's going to wrap up this chat. Thank you so much, Charlie, for coming along and speaking to us and answering all our questions. And thank you again to everybody who attended today and everybody who's watching on the YouTube channel. And we hope to see you again soon.